I remember the exact moment I realized my mind wasn't fully mine. It wasn't a dramatic revelation. No lightning in the sky, no booming voice from above. It was quieter than that, and far more unsettling. I was sitting alone, thinking about a decision I had to make when it hit me. My thoughts sounded familiar. Not familiar in the way a favorite song is, but familiar like a script I'd heard 1,000 times before. And then I understood. They weren't my words. They were someone else's. From the time you take your first breath, the world starts feeding you lines. Before you can walk, you've been handed beliefs. Before you can talk, you've been given a language built to frame the world in a certain way. Parents, teachers, television screens, the quiet rules of culture, they install their code into you one repetition at a time. Not to sharpen your thinking, but to make it predictable. And the dangerous part is, they do it so well, you don't notice it happening. By the time you're old enough to make your own choices, the choices are already pre-selected. You'll defend beliefs you didn't choose. You'll chase goals you never set. You'll fear things you've never actually experienced, and you'll swear it's all you. But it isn't. It's the system speaking through you. The truth: 99% of adults are walking through life with borrowed thoughts. They aren't stupid, they aren't lazy, they are conditioned. And when conditioning is deep enough, the prison doesn't need bars. It lives inside your head. Here's the part that should scare you. Most people will never realize it. They'll build their lives around someone else's blueprint. They'll raise their kids inside the same cage. They'll call it tradition, success, or the way things are, and they'll be proud of it, because when the programming is invisible, obedience feels like free will. But if you're here, if you're still listening, then somewhere deep, inside you already sense it, the cracks in the wall, the small moments when the script doesn't fit. That's why this matters. This isn't just a story, it's a key. And by the end of this, you'll see the locks for what they are. Before we go further, do one thing for me. Hit subscribe. Not for me, but for you. Because if you're ready to keep pulling at these threads, you'll need to hear the rest. And what comes next might just be the thing that changes everything. Now, I'll leave you with a question to start unwinding the cage. If most of your thoughts were given to you by someone else, would you A, keep them because they've kept you safe? B, replace them, even if it means losing the world you've always known? Comment your answer, A or B, below. And don't just type it, think about it, because how you answer might tell you how free you really are. I used to believe intelligence was the ultimate shield against control. I thought if you were smart enough, curious enough, and worked hard enough, you could see through the lies, spot the traps, and navigate your way to freedom. But the longer I lived inside the system, the more I realized the opposite was true. Intelligence didn't protect you, it made you easier to keep. The system loves smart people. It celebrates them, rewards them, puts them on pedestals. Not because it wants them free, but because it knows how to redirect their minds into serving it. You're given praise for solving problems, but never for asking who created them. You're given medals for your memory, but never for questioning why certain facts matter more than others. You're trained to excel at assignments inside a structure you never chose. And the better you perform, the more tightly you're bound to it. I've met doctors, engineers, lawyers, professors, brilliant minds who could deconstruct complex theories, master intricate systems, and work 18-hour days without breaking. And yet, when I asked them why they were doing what they were doing, the answers were always the same. It's what I trained for. It's what I'm supposed to do. It's what people like me do. They didn't realize those sentences were just echoes of the script handed to them decades earlier. When you're smart, the system gives you more to lose. It wraps you in comfort, titles, credentials, respect, a steady paycheck. It gives you an identity so polished, so reinforced by the applause of others, that the thought of leaving feels like tearing off your own skin. The walls of the cage aren't made of steel, they're made of velvet. And velvet doesn't hurt, it soothes. It makes you believe you're not trapped at all. That's why intelligent people often become the most obedient. They know how to play the game well. They collect gold stars, promotions, accolades. They master the rules. But mastery of a game you didn't choose isn't freedom. It's just refined captivity. The trap isn't that you can't leave. The trap is you don't want to. I learned this the hard way. For years, I thought my ability to outthink others meant I was in control. But I wasn't designing my own life. I was designing someone else's. Every decision I made, what to study, where to work, how to measure success, was just me rearranging furniture inside the same cage. My intelligence had been rented out, repurposed to serve the architecture of a system that had existed long before me and would exist long after, feeding on minds like mine. The system doesn't fear the loud rebel who shouts in the streets. That kind of rebellion is visible, containable, and often burns out. What it fears is the quiet mind that sees the game for what it is and simply stops playing. The one that doesn't just question the rules, but questions why the game exists at all. The one that takes its intelligence off the market and begins to invest it inward, building something that cannot be bought or controlled. The moment you do that, you become unpredictable. And unpredictability is dangerous to a system built on control. They can't manage you if they can't motivate you with titles or scare you with the threat of losing them. They can't bribe you with praise or imprison you with identity. You become a free agent in a world where most people are still bargaining away their thoughts for security they don't actually own. I think about the faces of those still inside. The colleagues who measure their worth by the size of their office, the students who mistake grades for growth, the professionals who stay in careers they hate because the paycheck validates their sacrifices. I see myself in them. I see the years I spent convincing myself I was winning because I was outperforming everyone else in the same maze. And I remember how terrifying it was to consider that maybe the maze wasn't worth running at all. Leaving isn't easy. You have to dismantle the identity you've spent your life building. You have to admit that much of your effort, discipline, and achievement went toward maintaining a structure that never truly served you. You have to face the silence that comes when you no longer have the system telling you what to do next. And, worst of all, you have to accept that people will misunderstand you. Some will call you ungrateful. Others will call you reckless. A few will simply stop talking to you because your choice to walk away will remind them of the choices they never made. But if you can push through that discomfort, there's something on the other side the system can't offer. It's not applause. It's not recognition. It's something quieter, steadier, ownership. The ability to direct your intelligence toward problems you choose in a world you design. The freedom to wake up in the morning and know your thoughts are your own, not programmed responses to someone else's incentives. That's when you start to understand the real purpose of intelligence. It's not to make you a better player in their game. It's to give you the tools to build your own. And the irony is, the moment you do that, you become the kind of person the system could never create and will never control. I won't pretend it's easy. I won't pretend the fear disappears, but I will tell you this. The first day you wake up outside the velvet cage, you realize it was never safety that kept you inside. It was the illusion of it. And once that illusion breaks, you can't unsee it. You can't go back. And maybe that's the point. The system's greatest trick isn't that it forces you to obey. It's that it convinces you obedience is your idea. Once you see that, you've already begun your escape. I didn't realize it at the time, but my life had become a perfect loop. Every day was a rerun of the one before, and because I was good at playing my part, I didn't question the script. I woke up to an alarm I didn't set for myself. I checked. my phone before my eyes were fully open, absorbing messages, headlines, and schedules that had nothing to do with my own goals. I went to a job that existed before I was born, followed a calendar someone else had designed, solved problems that weren't mine, and chased outcomes I never chose. At night, I collapsed into bed too exhausted to ask the one question that mattered. Why? That's the loop. Quiet, invisible, and endlessly self-reinforcing. It feels productive because it keeps you moving. It feels responsible because it's what everyone else is doing. It even feels impressive if you're getting praise for how well you're performing inside it. But it's still a loop, and a loop doesn't move you forward. It just keeps you running in circles. The most dangerous thing about the loop is how harmless it looks. You think you're building something, but really you're maintaining something. You think you're advancing, but really you're orbiting the same center point. The system doesn't have to force you to stay, it just has to keep rewarding you for not leaving. And the better you perform inside the loop, the harder it is to see it for what it is. It took me years to notice the pattern because I was too busy winning inside it. Promotions, bigger paychecks, recognition from peers. It all felt like progress. But I wasn't measuring the right thing. I was measuring performance inside someone else's system instead of progress toward my own freedom. That's the trick. They don't just keep you inside the loop, they make you proud to be there. When I finally started to see it, I realized the loop wasn't just my routine, it was my thinking. The system had trained me to think in straight lines. Do this, then that, then the next thing. Study, get a job, climb the ladder, retire. It's a conveyor belt disguised as a path. Every step is laid out for you so you don't have to ask what's next. But the truth is, the path doesn't lead anywhere new. It just leads you back to where you started, over and over again, until time runs out. The first step to breaking. It was to stop thinking in lines and start thinking in systems. When you think in lines, you're always asking, what's next? When you think in systems, you ask, what repeats? And that question changes everything. Once you see a loop, you can break it, you can rewire it, or better yet, you can build your own. I started by asking myself 3 questions every morning. What am I repeating that isn't moving me forward? I wrote down habits, routines, and even conversations that were keeping me in orbit instead of moving me somewhere new. What system am I unknowingly feeding? It was shocking to realize how much of my time was spent building value for other people's dreams, businesses, and goals, while my own ideas collected dust. And finally, what loop do I need to build instead? Instead of waiting for the system to hand me a new set of steps, I began designing my own, a daily writing habit, a skill that would compound over time, a project that could grow without constant permission or approval. The more I practiced this, the more I saw how deep the conditioning went. The loop wasn't just in my job. It was in how I approached learning, reading what was popular instead of what was useful. It was in how I measured success, comparing myself to people in the same trap, instead of asking if I was moving toward the life I actually wanted. It was even in how I thought about time, treating it as something to be filled rather than something to be invested. The hardest part wasn't seeing the loop, it was breaking it, because once you start to pull away, the system fights to pull you back in, not with force, but with comfort, the paycheck you're used to, the recognition you've been conditioned to crave, the security you think you're losing, even though it was never truly yours. And then there's the fear of starting from zero, the fear of being misunderstood, the fear of what happens when you no longer have the structure to tell you who you are. But here's what I learned. Breaking the loop doesn't mean you destroy everything overnight. It means you interrupt the pattern one small act at a time. You replace one borrowed thought with an original one. You swap one meaningless task for something that builds toward your own system. You stop asking, how do I do this better? And start asking, Why am I doing this at all? The day I stopped checking my phone in the morning was the first real crack in the wall. It sounds small, but it was the first time I decided what my mind would consume before the world decided for me. From there, I started reclaiming other parts of my day. An hour for my own projects before work, a rule to read only what I could apply immediately, a habit of asking who benefits before saying yes to anything. Slowly, the loop began to lose its grip. I stopped living by a calendar designed by someone else. I stopped trading hours for approval. I stopped chasing metrics that didn't matter to me. And in their place, I built a different kind of loop, one designed to serve me. Learn something, apply it, teach it, turn it into an asset, repeat. Every cycle added value that stayed with me, instead of vanishing into someone else's ledger. That's when I understood the real difference between living in the loop and building your own. In the system's loop, every day you repeat makes you more dependent. In your own loop, every day you repeat makes you more free, and that freedom compounds. The system needs you to keep feeding it. But once you start feeding yourself, mentally, financially, creatively, it loses its hold. The truth is, you don't escape the loop by working harder inside it. You escape by stepping outside and building something that makes it irrelevant. You don't need to burn it down. You don't need to argue with it. You just need to stop giving it what it needs to survive. Your time, your attention, your obedience. And once you stop, something remarkable happens. The loop that kept you running in circles turns into a launch pad. You're no longer moving just to move. You're moving with intention, with direction, with ownership. And when you look back, you'll wonder how you ever mistook motion for progress. Because the loop is only invisible until you see it. And once you do, you can never unsee it. I used to think life was just the way it was supposed to be, a series of steps laid out for me, a game I had no choice but to play. You grow up, you get an education, you find a job, you work hard, you save, you retire, and then you hope the years left are enough to enjoy what's left of you. For a long time, I didn't even question it. I was too busy trying to play the game well. I didn't realize the game itself was the problem. No one tells you this when you're young, but you can't win a game you didn't design. You can get good at it, sure. You can rack up all the points they tell you matter, degrees, promotions, possessions, but in the end, the scoreboard isn't even yours. Someone else built it, someone else sets the rules, and someone else decides what counts as winning. And the best players are often the most trapped, because they've invested too much into proving themselves inside a world that was never built for their freedom. The system doesn't need to force you to play. It just needs to make the game feel real. And it does this masterfully. From the moment you enter school, the rules are introduced. Be on time, follow the schedule, do the work exactly as assigned. You get points for compliance, grades, gold stars, praise. That's the first lesson. Structure equals safety, and obedience equals reward. By the time you step into adulthood, the classroom is gone, but the rules have stayed. Only now, the gold stars have been replaced by paychecks, promotions, and polite applause for staying inside the lines. I began to see that the real world was just a more elaborate version of the same system I grew up in. The same bells, only now called deadlines. The same assigned seating, only now called job titles. The same final exams, only now called performance reviews. And the scariest part was that most people didn't even see it as a game. They saw it as life. I started noticing the four main levers the game used to keep people playing. The first was time. We're taught to trade hours for worth, to believe the longer we work, the more we deserve. But all that really happens is that we get older. I watched people pour decades into companies, convinced they were building toward something, only to find themselves disposable the moment the system no longer needed them. They didn't just lose their job, They lost their sense of self because their identity was tied to the hours they'd sold. The second was money. We're told that hard work leads to wealth, but I've seen people work themselves into the ground without ever touching financial freedom. That's because the game doesn't reward effort, it rewards leverage. It rewards those who own the systems, not those who operate inside them. And yet, the narrative of work harder keeps people locked in the same cycle, because it feels noble to grind, even if it's slowly draining you. Then there was identity. The game teaches you to keep yourself small, to be realistic, to fit in. Anything too ambitious, too loud, too different gets labeled as arrogance or recklessness. You learn to edit yourself, to dim your ideas, to soften your dreams until they fit the mold. I realized how many parts of myself I had silenced simply because they didn't align with what was expected. And the more I conformed, the more the system praised me. I thought I was being humble. Really, I was being contained. And finally, fear. This was the game's most powerful lever. Fear of losing stability. Fear of starting over. Fear of being judged. Fear is what makes you stay even when you know the game is rigged. I saw it in others, and I saw it in myself. The way we cling to the known, even when it's killing us, because at least it's familiar. The system doesn't have to block the exit. It just has to make the outside look dangerous enough that you never try the door. Once I saw these levers, I couldn't unsee them. And I realized escaping the game wasn't about rebelling loudly or tearing it down from the inside. It was about perception, about recognizing that it was a game at all. That was the first crack in its power over me. I began asking myself questions I'd never allowed before. What game am I actually playing? Who benefits from me playing it? What rules am I following that aren't even real? And the answers were sobering. Most of what I'd been chasing wasn't for me. It was for the scoreboard. And most of the rules I thought were unbreakable were just ideas someone had repeated enough times to make them feel like law. When I started breaking those false rules, nothing catastrophic happened. In fact, the opposite happened. I said no to working extra hours on projects that didn't matter to me, and my value didn't disappear. It simply became mine again. I stopped believing I needed a certain title to justify my worth, and I found that my confidence didn't depend on a nameplate. I stopped chasing promotions I didn't want, and instead, I built projects that aligned with the life I actually wanted to live. The truth is, the people who escape don't necessarily work harder or take bigger risks. They just stop playing by rules that don't exist. They stop trying to win a game they didn't choose and start building one they can own. And when you do that, something remarkable happens. You realize you were never trapped by the game. You were trapped by the belief that you had to play, and most people never reach that point. They retire believing they've won because they followed the script perfectly, even if the script led them somewhere they never wanted to be. And that's the tragedy. The applause they get at the finish line isn't for living a free life. It's for playing the role the system assigned them, right until the end. I don't want that to be my ending. I don't want my legacy to be that I played well. I want it to be that I walked away, not in anger, but in clarity. That I saw the board for what it was and decided to stop moving my pieces according to someone else's strategy. That I built something outside the game entirely. Something no one could take away because it didn't exist on their scoreboard. Escaping the game isn't about becoming a rebel. It's about becoming a creator. It's about realizing that the only victory worth having is one you define yourself. And once you taste that kind of freedom, no prize inside the game will ever tempt you again. I used to think I needed more knowledge, more skills, more credentials. I thought if I just kept learning what the world told me to learn, I'd eventually be free. But over time, I realized I wasn't getting smarter in any meaningful way. I was just getting better at thinking the way they wanted me to think. My intelligence wasn't mine. My goals weren't mine. Even my definition of success was borrowed. That's when I understood something that shook me. Most people don't fail because they're not intelligent. They fail because their intelligence belongs to someone else. Their thoughts are stitched together from the voices of teachers, bosses, news anchors, algorithms, and the constant hum of a culture that rewards conformity. And I was no different. I thought I was thinking for myself, but I was just rearranging the same old ideas that had been planted in me years ago. Mental autonomy became my obsession, not rebellion for rebellion's sake, but ownership. The ability to choose what my mind consumes, how it processes, and what it produces. It's the kind of independence that no one can hand you, because it has to be built from the inside out. And the first step to building it was to cut the default inputs. The truth is, most minds aren't free because they're never quiet. The system keeps us saturated with noise, opinions, outrage, distraction, comparison, so we don't have the space to think a thought that hasn't already been handed to us. I didn't realize how dependent I'd become on this constant feed until I cut it off. One day I decided to stop consuming entirely for 24 hours. No social media, no podcasts, no news, no conversations that weren't intentional. At first it felt unbearable, like my mind was clawing for its usual fix. But beneath that discomfort was something I hadn't felt in years, my own voice. That silence became addictive. Not because it was peaceful, though it was, but because it was mine. For the first time, I could hear the difference between what I truly believed and what I'd been taught to repeat. It was like stepping out of a crowded room into fresh air. And in that air, I started rebuilding my learning system from scratch. Stopped treating knowledge like a bucket to be filled, and started treating it like a tool to be sharpened. That meant curating what I consumed with ruthless intention. I didn't care if something was popular, only if it was useful. I stopped chasing trends and started studying principles, wealth creation, human psychology, systems thinking, the mechanics of influence. The kind of knowledge that compounds over time instead of expiring with the next wave of content. Learning in layers became my new approach. Instead of reading something once and moving on, I'd apply it immediately, teach it to someone else, then revisit it from a new angle. Every time I cycled back, the idea became sharper, more my own, and I created feedback loops that had nothing to do with exams or performance reviews, just reality. Did this idea make my life freer? Did it improve my systems, my relationships, my income? If not, it didn't matter how clever it sounded. But mental autonomy isn't just about learning differently. It's about unlearning the job mindset. For years, I'd been conditioned to believe my value came from trading my time for someone else's approval. It took a long time to even ask the question, what if I traded my thinking for freedom instead? That meant building something I could own, a skill, a product, a process that could generate value without my constant presence. The moment I started working for myself in this way, everything shifted. I wasn't waiting for permission anymore. I was building leverage, and with that shift came a new definition of value. For most of my life, I thought value meant achievement, a degree, a title, a salary. But those things can be taken from you the moment you stop serving the system that gave them to you. Real value is impact plus independence. If it makes you more dependent, no matter how shiny it looks, it's not value. If it makes you more free, even if it's small, it's priceless. I began asking myself a simple question every time I pursued something. Does this increase my options or limit them? The system teaches you to chase things that look prestigious, but actually narrow your freedom. A high-paying job that owns your time, a degree that locks you into a single career path, a house that ties you to debt for decades. Mental autonomy flips that. You build assets, skills, and relationships that multiply your choices, not reduce them. Over time, I realized I didn't just want intelligence. I wanted sustainable intelligence, a mind that fuels itself, that upgrades without needing the approval or structure of the system. That required a different kind of discipline, Not the discipline to grind endlessly, but the discipline to think intentionally. I built a personal operating system for my mind. A clear purpose. Why I think, not just what I think. A system for evolving, daily learning, daily application, daily reflection. Feedback, constantly checking my beliefs against reality and being willing to discard what no longer served me. Reflection, asking what I learned each day that I didn't know the day before. And repetition, locking in these cycles until they became second nature. The result was something I hadn't felt since I was a child, a sense of self that wasn't for sale. I no longer needed the system to tell me who I was or whether I was doing well. My progress wasn't measured in promotions or applause, but in freedom. Every decision was filtered through one question. Does this make me more sovereign? And every time the answer was yes, I knew I was on the right path. The system fears this kind of mind because it's uncontrollable. You can't be bribed with titles or trapped with fear when you own the means of your own thinking. You don't rebel for the sake of rebellion. You simply stop participating in the games that don't serve you. And in doing so, you create a new reality, one that others will eventually want to follow because it's built on something they've forgotten they had: choice. This is mental autonomy. Not loud, not defiant, but quietly unstoppable. Once you have it, you stop asking for freedom. You start living it. And the system that once shaped you into obedience, it becomes irrelevant. Because the moment your mind belongs to you, so does your life.